is Long Way to the Top, and I'm your host, Shane Bryan. Alan Edwards, the godfather of British music PR, has worked with some of the most legendary artists of our time, David Bowie to the Spice Girls, Rolling Stones, Stranglers, Blondie, Prince, Amy Winehouse. His book, I Was There, is a snapshot of life in the fast-paced rock world with stories like working with Keith Moon, heading to the US to work with Blondie, football matches with Bob Marley, listening to Prince during discussing the future of civilisation, or getting into the middle of a power struggle between Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. And now he joins us on the release of the Think Loud for Parkinsons project and his work with the man behind it, Ian Grant, the rock god's right-hand man, Alan Edwards. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, great to be here, Shane. I hope you're having a good evening, and I love that fast-paced intro. Very good. Covered a lot of
ground. Look, before we start, I think it would be prudent of us just to touch on the death of the drummer of Blondie.
Yeah, I was going to do that actually.
Yeah.
I had a very Blondie weekend because Debbie came into London for a wedding on Saturday and asked me to come along with her. It was a wedding for Mike Chapman, and he was marrying a lady called Maddie. Mike was the producer writer for all the big records in the 70s and 80s, Parallel Lines.
Chinny Chap,
of course. So Debbie and I had a really fun afternoon, went to the wedding, caught up on some stories, talked about the Sex Pistols, talked about early Blondie, talked about school, everything you could imagine as you do in the course of a day. But she did tell me that Clem was really ill. I knew he'd been unwell. I didn't realise quite how, quite what a perilous state he was in until that point. So, so we had the happy day, but we had a bit of a sad parting because we talked about, Clem. And but then, of course, I got the news that he had passed away.
Yeah.
I had an enormous amount of people got in touch. I mean, you could sort of tell how many people that Clem has touched, and all kinds of people, from Gary Kemp, Chris Difford from Squeeze got in touch and said that Clem had been really, really helpful to them at the beginning of their career. Roger Daltrey called and said he was the best drummer the Who never had. I mean, there's such an outpouring because as well as being, he was a brilliant drummer. I mean, obviously Keith Moon was his hero, and he had a very strong style. And when you listen back to those early Blondie records, a lot of it is built around the drumming rhythm, so he was an integral part. But he was also a really lovely, amiable chap. He's a really nice guy. So it's kind of a shocking, just a shock for all of us. I think it happened so fast, and also for me, and reflecting on it, very soon after Brian James of the Damned, who of course Ian Grant and I knew very well. I even managed Brian at one point, so it's sort of it's a bit of a strange time.
I see you've got the Blondie Atomic cover there on the wall behind you, and ironically, that was the song that I played today on radio, just to pay tribute to Clem.
Oh, perfect.
Such a sad.
And there is Clem up above the top of my left-hand head. In between Iggy and Generation X, with his hands in his pockets and that sleeve up there. So I've realised I've known him nearly 50 years, which is quite a time.
Yeah, long time in the music industry. Of course, you've been in the music industry seems like forever. Your mentor, I guess, at the start, the guy who gave you the first start was Keith Oldham, who I believe advised Jimi Hendrix to set fire to his guitar.
He did. Keith was one of the last people actually with Jimmy, but he'd gone out to Monterey Pop, and I think he'd either gone with or met Brian Jones out there. It was quite a happening thing, and he was working for The Who, but he was also working with Jimmy, and he told Jimmy it would be a great... they're all very competitive. Everyone wanted to be the headliner and steal the show. And Jimmy said, "What can I do, Keith?" And Keith said, "Well, why don't you put some paraffin and set fire to the guitar?" And the rest is history. Poor old Jimmy had to do it every show for the next few years.
Went through a lot of guitars.
And I think the Who were miffed. I mean, not that the Who needed any help because they're always the most incredible live act, but that was a stunt that Jimmy pulled. Keith told me a funny story about Keith's not very well, to be honest. He
Right.
told me a funny story about Jimmy recently. I should relay. And he said they were in New York, and this was going down to the Monterey Pop Festival where he advised him to do it. And they'd met up in New York and gone down to Monterey. And he said they were trying to get a taxi, um, and Keith went out in the road to sort of hail a cab, and Jimmy
Mm.
stood back, and Keith couldn't understand it. Anyway, the cab pulls up, they get in it, or Kid gets in, and then Jimmy jumps in, and then the driver goes off on a rant using the N word about I don't normally pick up
Mm.
people like you to Jimmy and all the rest of
Wow.
it. Keith, being a super liberal, was indignant, upset, and berated the taxi driver on civil rights and how can you behave like this and that
Yeah.
and the other. But Jimmy didn't say a word, just sat there quietly in the back of the cab. And when they got out, Keith said to him, "Well, why did you say so stum, Jimmy? You never said a word. What was it?" And he said, Keith, I've been having to deal with that shit every day of my life. And secondly, didn't you notice he had a massive gun on the seat beside him? So, there you go.
Wow.
An interesting Hendrix story.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I guess there was pivotal moments in your whole life throughout the whole PR career, and of course, the book has a lot of those moments. I was stunned to hear that, and maybe this is a regret of yours, but I was stunned to hear that you were offered the publishing rights for U2 for four
Oh,
thousand
God.
pounds. Is that a regret?
Regret. Regret, Shane. I'm suicidal even after all this time. I mean, Paul McGuinness was the manager, but I remember the first gig they did in London was at a place called Dingwalls, and it was half empty. And Paul couldn't afford the airfare from Dublin to London. So he said,
Wow.
"Would you take down a couple of record companies?" So I remember I took down a guy from Chrysalis Records, and I was working with them on Blondie actually at that
Right.
time. And the guy, I remember he kept his driver outside the club with the engine turning over. After two songs, he said to me, "This band are never going to happen. Nobody wants guitar bands. It's all about synthesizers." And
Yeah.
he said, "I'm off to Mr. Chow's for dinner." And he walked out. Anyway, I was talking to Paul a day or two later, and he said, "Look, if you could raise, I'd like you to get involved with the band. If you could raise £4,000, you could sign their publishing, and then you'd be
Mm.
part of the, whole setup." So I went to see my bank manager because I obviously didn't have that kind of money. It was quite a lot of money then.
Yeah.
And he was called Mr. Graham, and he was in the Archway Road in London N6, and it was the NatWest Bank. And I went in and I sat there in the bank, and he had a pinstripe suit and spectacles, and he looked at me sort of imperiously, and I said, "Well, I'd like to borrow £4,000." And he looked at me like, "What?" And he said, "What for?" And I said, "Well, I want to sign the publishing rights to a pop group called U2." And he looked at me like I was mad. And he said, "Don't you realise you're £3.50 overdrawn?" And he wouldn't give me the money. So anyway, I couldn't raise the money and I didn't sign them. And of course, this publishing would have been worth not millions, billions. And
Yeah.
I saw Paul McGuinness, and this story was in my head, and I used to wake up in the middle of the night upset about it for a long time. And I saw Paul about 3 or 4 years ago, and I'd kind of convinced myself by then that it had just been a fantasy and it never happened,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And almost the first thing Paul said to me was, "Do you remember when you failed to sign the group for £4,000, what it would have been worth now?" Oh, no. So yeah, that was not my
Wow.
best business decision ever.
Jeez. Jeez.
But depressed. But there
What?
you go. I mean, it just was hard to. I was living in a flat in Islington. The rent was £4 a week, and I was struggling to pay it.
Yeah.
So £4,000
Was
seemed
a
just
lot of
beyond
money.
my wildest dreams.
What got you started in the PR industry? Was it just a love of music?
Yeah, well, my first obsession was football, but by about the age of 11-ish, I was listening to Radio Luxembourg under the pillow at nights, as people used to, and signal was fading in and fading out, and I really, really became, obsessed with music. And then it was all the pirates, Caroline stations like that.
Yeah.
Um, so I was writing at school. I was writing letters under the desk to the music papers, to the Melody Maker and things,
Yeah,
saying,
right.
"Could you give me a job? I'm really keen on music." And of course, they never answered. Years later, I met Chris Welch, one of the guys I wrote to from the Melody Maker, and said, "You still haven't answered my letters." And he was looking for some albums, but he was a nice guy. But so I was a natural communicator for
Yeah,
some reason. When I was a kid, I'd go and I was evangelical, and whatever it was, whether it was a footballer or a music song, I would talk to everybody in the street, people I'd never met. I'd go
yeah,
up to them and say, "Oh, have you heard this track by Hawkwind or Atomic Rooster or whatever
yeah,
it was?" And they'd look at me a bit bemused. I just had this natural desire to share things like that, and so I kind of knew that I wanted to be in music, and I knew that I liked talking and
yeah,
writing. So when I was at a Who gig in Bingley, Staffordshire. I was reviewing it for Sounds, and when Keith
yeah,
Altham said to me afterwards, "Would you like to be in PR?" I thought, well, maybe. But then I thought they all look a bit shifty, PRs. I'm not sure. It
yeah,
might be ducking and diving. So I thought, well, I'll do it for 4 weeks, pay off pay the rent down a bit. And you just sometimes know you're in the right place in life. You maybe found that,
mm,
when you started doing the radio shows.
yeah.
And I mean, literally, that was half a century ago. I never ever never looked back, never had a second thought, never wanted to do anything else. So really, because I didn't go to university or anything like that, it's kind of been one natural long progression.
Yeah, yeah. And is there a certain, I guess, genre that you particularly align yourself with? Because there was a period there where you were known as the punk PR guy.
Yeah, I was the punk PR guy, and then in the 80s, I was more the stadium rock guy because I was
Yeah,
working with Bowie and the Stones and stuff like that. So that became my expertise. In the 90s, courtesy of really the Spice Girls, I became the pop guru, and suddenly
yeah.
I was looking after everyone you could think of: All Saints, Westlife, Ronan Keating. I had
Wow.
the whole collection. It's like a stamp collection, and then I suppose it's very strange because everyone goes where they perceive the right places to be. And then
Yeah,
in the 2000s, Amy, Nick Cave, but then also I've had a big R&B strand to my career. So
yeah,
Prince, Michael Jackson, I know we're not allowed to mention it, Usher, so a lot of
yeah.
those big American, I got a reputation for working in that field and earlier on Luther
Yes.
Vandross and things like that. So the truth is, in a way, these genres pick me rather than me pick
Yes.
the genres, if you know what I mean. In terms of my own personal taste, I know everyone says it, but it's very eclectic.
Yes.
And I listen 3 or 4 hours a day, really, on a good normal day.
Yeah.
And I'm really going everything from, Miles Davis to Buddy Holly to Youngblood. It's
Yeah.
quite different minutes, different moods. A bit like I'm sure with you. Sometimes I
Yeah.
want bit of country. Sometimes I want to listen to Handel.
Yeah.
Sometimes I want Motorhead and metal.
Yeah. Yeah. And you do find, I mean, I find that there are certain favorites that I tend to gravitate towards. But I guess
Yeah,
it's a bit like, your children, you really don't have a favorite child. You know what I mean? And same with you with your PR work. You don't
yeah.
have a favorite band that
You,
you
you-
work with.
that's very, very true. Although I do personally find that I gravitate back a lot to Van Morrison, Lou Reed,
Yeah.
Nico. Those
Yeah.
kind of singer-songwriters seem to have a magnetic pull for me.
Did you work with the likes of Nico?
No, I didn't, sadly. I did see her. I worked with Lou Reed for a little bit,
Yeah.
which was an interesting experience. Yeah, I remember taking Lou Reed to the GQ Awards, and it was a big thing at the time. And I'd been with him all day. We'd been doing interviews and stuff.
Mm.
And I did the red carpet with him, and I got in the lift, and I was in a lift, and there was Ray Davis and a few other people in this lift. And I said to Lou, I started talking to Lou and said, "Look, when we get upstairs, you'll meet the editor." And he looked at me and he just said, "Who are you?" And he knew exactly what he was doing. And I was like, I had to go, "I'm your PR." And Ray Davis was just almost wetting himself, giggling, and everyone
Yeah.
was sniggering and all the rest of it. And I thought, as we got to the next, we got up, I thought, I better turn this round really quickly. and I had about 100 yards before we met the editor of GQ and all the important people. So I suddenly started talking about to Lou into his ear about the very first album. This was before Transformer.
Yeah.
And I was quoting lyrics from different tracks and said, "Oh, how did you produce that?" And this, that, and the other. And he kind of looked, he did a double take. And when we got to the end of this 100 yards and we talked maybe 180 seconds, we get there. And he said to Dylan Jones, the editor, oh, he said, "This is Alan Edwards. He's my PR guy. He's a great guy, blah, blah, blah." Just, and that was a really interesting lesson in PR. And you have this very, very
Yeah.
often where you have literally 1 minute to kind of correct a situation
Yeah.
or involve yourself in it. And that's where my knowledge and love of music made all the difference.
Yes.
I knew that if I could talk to him about this album, which hadn't been a commercial success, he would know that I really understood him to some degree. And I've had to do
Yeah.
that kind of thing, not just with music, so many times where it's split second and somehow instinctively you've got to be able to dig into this stuff. But if you haven't listened to a lot of music, you won't be able to do it.
And it really shows that you're a true fan, and I think that's what they really want to know and want to work with. That you're a true fan of their work.
Yeah.
You know.
Deep down, yeah, because I didn't get into this because I like famous people or celebrity. I got into it because I really, really loved the
Yeah.
music, and I could talk to them about who was playing bass on what track, and
Yeah.
which album was the single was recorded on, and so on. And I think that is that is
Mm.
yeah, that's where you start in this job, really.
Mm. Now, I want to talk about your weirdest experience.
Ha.
It was there. Oh, you've probably got a million weird experiences. What was your weirdest that you can recollect?
I'm at Milan Airport, and David Bowie is doing a show in Milan, and the tickets have not sold for some reason. So I've called up the radio station, and they promised me that they're going to do a load of hype at the airport. So my job is to create a sort of mini press conference event with David arriving. He's coming in from Germany or
Yeah.
something like that. So I got to the airport and I'm at the gate where he's coming in, and there's nobody there. And
Yeah.
my friend at the radio station has forgotten to put out the story or something. So nobody knows David's
Oh
arriving in
no.
Milan. And I'm supposed to be there with a mob of screaming people and photographers and whatever. And I go into a cold sweat and I think, what can I do? What can I do? And then it says, David's flight has arrived. And I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a
Oh.
disaster. So I noticed that at the next gate, there's a flight coming from somewhere like Malaga, and there's hundreds of tourists sort of pouring out. So I quickly get hold of the barriers and turn them round and point the barriers from Malaga back up to the one that David's coming out of. David, who luckily comes off the flight last because he's getting himself dressed up to
Yeah.
meet the public, comes down and there's a mob of people pushing and shouting and shoving. And by then, some police have been called to try and break it up. And it looks like a riot. So David's great. He walks through it all, hasn't clocked. The story gets weirder though, because I think, well, I better quit while I'm ahead, and I don't wait for his car. I see there's a taxi there at the curbside, so I literally push him in the taxi and say something to the driver. Anyway, the driver doesn't hear me properly, but he realizes he's got David Bowie in the back of his taxi, so he assumes David must be staying in the best hotel in Milan. Takes him to the top hotel. David walks in with his suitcases. Everybody in the hotel, there's no booking for David, but they assume that it was David Bowie. So they show him up to the royal suite, put him
No.
in this beautiful suite. Meantime, Bowie's supposed to be staying with the band back at some Holiday Inn sort of motel type thing. And the tour manager is tearing out his hair. And after 2 or 3 hours, David's been sitting there in this room on his own, not heard from anyone. Nobody knows where he is. And the tour manager realizes what could have happened. So he's literally had to call on every hotel in Milan until he finds where David is.
We've lost David Bowie.
So that was pretty weird, stroke
I
funny.
was I was also thinking about your work with Prince, and
Yeah.
the fact that the Prince wouldn't actually even talk to you directly, that he would talk to you through one of his bodyguards who was standing
Yeah.
2 feet away from you. I mean, that would be a pretty surreal experience.
Yeah. We had one that stuck in my mind in Rotterdam. And he'd done a show, I think, at the Ahoy, which is a big venue there, fantastic performance. And I'd been tasked with bringing out about a dozen journalists from the UK media. And at that time, it was the Sun, the Mirror, the Star, the Mail, whatever. We'd gone to the concert, and afterwards, word is sent to me that he may do a gig in a club.
Mm.
And that we should all wait there for him to perform. So we go to this club, we wait. Um, and it could midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And of course, by then I can't control the journalists all knocking back lots of drink and it's
Mm.
all the whole thing's falling apart. Anyway, it gets to about 6 or 7 in the morning and the daylight is starting to come on. And I get a call, Prince is on the way. Oh my God, how are we
No.
going to do it? So he turns up and he comes up to meet with me and he's with his bodyguard, whose name I can't remember actually. And the bodyguard is, I don't know, 10 inches from me, and Prince is bang in front of me, like
Yeah.
12 inches, if you like. So we have this whole discussion for 10 minutes on whether or not we should do the gig. He should do the gig. He doesn't address one word to me. He said to the
Wow.
bodyguard, "What do you think?" And then the bodyguard would say to me, "Alan, what do you think?" And then I would say, "Well, why not? I've got all the journalists here." And he would say, "Prince, Alan says he's got the journalists here." And the whole conversation was like that. And at the end of
That's
10 minutes,
bizarre.
Prince said, "Oh, I don't fancy it." And he went home.
Wow.
And
How do you
I had,
handle something like that as a PR agent? You know, this has become an absolute nightmare for you. You've got the journalists there that are just blind drunk by that time. You've got an artist who just goes, "No, I'm doing my own thing and choose my own." You must see that all the time, that they just do their own thing.
yeah, you see it all the time, and you're walking on a tightrope all the time because you've got you've got 1 foot in the camp of the journalists and 1 foot in the sort of artist sort of camp, and it's really tricky. Sometimes you go too far one way or the other. But the short answer to that is you really need to you need to have a sense of humor or
Yeah,
laissez-faire. I think you also need to have a deep understanding and respect of artists.
yeah,
And I often remind myself, wow, this guy can get up and stand on a stage and perform in front of 100,000 people. That's a skill that I can't imagine that anyone else could do. So you've got to cut them some slack and you've got to, they just aren't regular people. And we don't
yeah,
want them to be regular people. We want them to be eccentric. I mean, and you can trace it all the way back to Beethoven or Dali or
yeah,
wherever you want to go. That's what an artist is. So I suppose I spent a lot of my life explaining
yeah.
that away, but I also see their point of view, and I think if you were very uptight and they're late and they haven't done what they said
Mm,
they'd do, you'd go
mm,
mad. You couldn't do this job.
mm. Now we got to the '90s and we had, the Spice Girls came along. Do you remember that phone call to say, "Can
Yeah.
you look after the Spice Girls?"
Well, the way it was, I'm in my office in Tottenham Court Road, and I'm very low key at that moment. I'm
Mm,
working with David Bowie more in a sort of semi-management role, and I'm
yeah,
worrying about getting airplay and radio stations in Denver or something. So it's all
yeah,
quite behind the scenes-ish. I get a call from Paul Conroy, who's the head of Virgin Records. He said, "Alan, can you come over to the office? I've got a client I'd like you to meet, potential client."
yeah.
So I get in the car, and in those days you could drive through quite easy. And I drive across London, get to Virgin Records. There's helicopters there, limousines, security guards. I think, well, this isn't massive attack. This can only be the Spice Girls because at
Yes.
that point they're like the Beatles.
Yeah.
I didn't even know which one was which. It wasn't my thing. So I called up my daughters. And I've said, which one's Ginger, which one's Scary? I mean, obviously I could work out Ginger, but I
Yeah.
had a breakdown on who was who. Um, and then I get shown into the boardroom at Virgin, and there's about 30 or 40 people there, and there's lawyers and marketing people, and it's all like a reverent sort of thing because there's millions and millions of pounds at
Yeah.
stake. And Paul does a little speech. He said, "This is Mr. Edwards. We've worked with him on David Bowie and Janet Jackson. We think he'd be very well equipped to guide you, blah, blah, blah. And have you got any questions?" So it goes quiet. And I'm sitting there sort of expecting a fusillade of questions
Yes.
about, how big is News International? What's the circulation of the Sunday Times? Who's the editor of the Daily Mirror?
Yes.
Whatever. I'm ready for this sort of, this barrage of questions. And then a voice pipes up and says, "Yeah, I've got a question for him." And Miss Cormoran said, "Okay, what's that?" And he said, "What kind of shoes are you wearing?" And I didn't know, Shane. I looked under the table and just happened to be hush puppies that day. There must have been, I don't know why. So I looked up and said, hush puppies. And there was this hush silence for about what seemed like 60 seconds, and no one said anything. And then one of the other voices piped up and said, oh, that'll do. And that's how I got hired to do the Spice Girls. I mean, I presume the decision wasn't really based on
Wasn't
my
based on your
shoes.
lucky shoes, no.
And
What's
then
the
within 24 hours, I was on the road with them in Rome, and we went to a press conference, and they were doing it in a hotel. And I remember I got out of the airport and I was in the taxi going to the hotel, and my lawyer, who's since passed away, a guy called Alexis, called me and said, "Oh, I see you're in the Via Garibaldi in Rome." And I said, "Well, how do you know? How do you even know I'm in Italy?" And he said, "Oh, it's all being tracked live on Sky News."
Yeah,
And I realized at that point, it was such the enormity of the
yeah.
story that the publicity agent going to meet the group was a national story.
It was
And
weird, wasn't it? It was such a
mad.
huge, huge thing.
It was huge. And then I literally became a spice boy because for the next 48 hours, I'd realized the only way to get on top of this was to be with them. And
Mm,
they went shopping in Paris. By the way, we didn't just get on it, they had a private plane. So, oh,
yeah.
like, we'd like to go shopping here. We'd like to go there. And we ended up in a disco in Madrid for some reason. I don't know. Um, and I'd got to know them all.
Yeah,
You do
yeah.
quite intensely over 2 days traveling like that. And I realized that they were all really smart individuals, and
Yeah.
particularly Victoria. I was very taken with her brightness, really. She's very funny, and I christened her Witty Spice.
Yes.
Very different to the sort of po-faced image that, you might see in photographs sometimes. So I decided that the previous approach to the Spice Girls had been to keep everything sort of almost totally tightly controlled, no
Yeah.
access. I said, well, we'll do the opposite. I'm going to bring all the media to meet you one on one because you're all brilliant. You can all handle, you're all
Mm,
great talkers. We don't need that kind of sort of Svengali type approach.
mm.
So I kind of broke all the barriers down. And from that day on, I started ferrying out people from the Express, the Mail, whatever, and they would do a one on one with Mel C or a one on one with
Yeah.
Mel B or Emma or whatever it was. And um, it worked absolutely brilliantly
That was
until it
going to be
didn't.
my question. How do you handle something like the Spice Girls? What's the first thing that you say to them when you start looking after them?
Well, the first thing you do, even before you talk to them, really, with all these things, is you have to, it's a bit like Sherlock Holmes, you have to analyze the problem and think about it, even if it's for 5 minutes or however you do it. And the problem then was that there were literally thousands of people from all around the world who wanted
Mm.
access. And there was no one person to get to them through, and
Yeah.
they weren't sure if they wanted to do anything. Um, so I then had to break that down, and I kind of looked at what Alistair Campbell was doing with New Labour and Tony Blair. And Alistair had this sort of thing where he'd break it down into journalists that liked Tony Blair, journalists that couldn't stand him, and journalists that were in the middle. And so Alistair would concentrate on the middle to try and convert them so that you had a
Yeah.
lot of people. So he was quite analytical, and I'd always been doing it by instinct, if you like,
Yes.
really. So I started making little charts, just scribbling with pen and paper. And I looked at all the articles very carefully. And I could see this is where they were getting good coverage, this is where bad coverage, and
Yes.
this was in between, which I thought could turn around. So by the time I sat down with the group, and we were on the tour, we would have a daily meeting every day at 12 o'clock. Um, the whole band would be there, all five of them, and I would be called up. They didn't have a manager at that stage,
Mm.
and myself and the lawyer and the accountant would be called up, and they would say, "Well, what do you recommend today?" And it was on a daily basis.
Yeah.
It was so big. It would be like, "Well, I've got a TV crew flown in from Brazil, and I've got the Sydney Morning Herald, and I've got the Daily Star, and they all want to do things, and I recommend we do this. I recommend we do that."
Yeah.
And nearly all the time, they would follow my advice.
Yeah.
And I would say, and they'd say, "Why?" Because they're all very clever. And why would we do the Sydney Morning Herald? And I say, well, because it's a really well written paper. It's high quality journalism,
Yeah.
and the person that's a writer there has already reviewed your record well, or something like that.
Yes.
So I'd have to have a thought process for everything, and then sell it to them, if you like, and then it'd be like a lot of focus on photographs. So it was Sunday Times Magazine. Who's taking the pictures? What have they done before?
Yeah.
So it was quite a science. This was not just off the cuff. And I would then be going and talking to hundreds of journalists,
Yeah.
and lots of them I'd be saying, well, no, I can't give you any access, or no, there's
Yeah.
not time, or they don't want to do it. But I can give you a behind the scenes and off the record, or I can tell you what they're going to have for breakfast tomorrow, or
Yeah.
what new songs they might be writing. So even though if you take, and then it was a very physical job as well. You couldn't do it
Yeah.
all remotely. You had to be there. You had to be on the ground with the writers in the stadium. So it might look, well, it might look fun and glamorous, and it probably is glamorous, sort of. But the workload is so,
Yeah.
for a group at that level, is so intense that you're not doing anything else. You're doing it
Yes.
24 hours.
Yes.
But what an exciting, incredible place to be, of course.
I guess another person that was such a very short flame, Amy Winehouse. I mean,
Yeah.
what a tragedy that was.
Very sad. I heard some demos of her. I can't remember who brought them to. I think maybe one of my daughters had come across them anyway, and that she had the most remarkable voice, and you just knew that she was going to be successful. And we ended up handling her PR, but you know, it was tragic because she was in this descent into hell, really,
Yeah.
with the drugs and the rest of it. And I remember her dad, Mitch, would come up to the office, and Mitch, I think, has been a bit unfairly portrayed in some of these
The movie and
films
that.
and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, he would come up to the office, he'd park his cab outside, and he'd come up and he would talk to me parent to parent because I had daughters, and he there was a limit to what he could do. I mean, Amy was not a child, Amy was an adult, and if Amy wanted to marry this person, she was perfectly able to. And
Yeah.
he did his best, but it was killing him seeing what she was doing to herself. And I mean, he would be sitting there for an hour, his head in his hands, and I saw him I saw that side of him. So
Mm.
it was very sad. And then, of course, you'd have everybody knew where she was living. She was in Camden Town. It was
Yeah.
very accessible. She was very much, she hated all that sort of superstar bullshit. She was
Mm.
just wanted to be a real person and go about a day and turn up in the pub and play a game of pool. I
Yeah.
mean, that's exactly how she was. Um, but of course, the realities of doing that in central London, especially then, which was at the height of the media, the tabloid media power,
Yeah.
and paparazzi was exploding. There were thousands of photographers in London from at that point from all around the world. So, however much one loved her for it, and it was endearing
Mm.
because she was
Mm.
the most authentic, real singer. I think probably you'd have to go to Billie Holiday or something. I mean, she
Yeah.
was the real deal.
Incredible voice.
But she didn't care, about all this drama. She just didn't worry about it. But of
Yeah.
course, that, it was very hard because then you'd have photographers knocking on her door in the middle of the night. She'd answer it, might have been just asleep or watching TV. They'd get a picture of her looking startled. And then
Mm.
people were, unfortunately, around situations like that, especially when there's drugs involved, you get people selling stories,
Yeah.
bad stories, just for a bit of smack or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the whole thing was getting worse and worse. We were dealing with we were trying to control it to some degree, and it was like a train sort of just leaving the tracks. You couldn't do much
Yeah.
about it. And we did to a degree. We would say when you're talking to a responsible editor, it'd be fine. You'd say, look, this picture wasn't taken under fair circumstances. Can
Yep.
you hold that off? And actually people did their best. But the whole thing was crazy. And then she was still doing shows. And that's
Yeah.
a big debate because we've seen that debate with many groups over the years, probably going back to the Doors or anything you like.
Mm.
There's the argument of if an artist is maybe taking drugs, should they or shouldn't they be on tour?
Yes.
Well, there's a strong argument that when they're on tour, they're okay because they've got a discipline, they've got a structure, they have to get
Yep.
up, they have to do the sound check, they've got other people around them. You can't just, and it seems like the excesses can get worse at the end of a tour when they're sitting on their own and they're flat and that's when it all kicks in. So it was an impossible situation and really sad. And when you look back, I know people cast blame in different directions. I think, well, you can't really blame the media because they were doing their job.
Yep.
They've got
Yep.
they've got holes in papers and they've got to fill them up. you can't really blame the record company because, in fact, Lucien Grange, the chairman of Universal, was very principled, and
Yes.
he stopped her working at one point. He said, "You can't go and get these Grammys unless you go to rehab." So he did
Yep.
his bit. The manager Ray was going through hell, on whether trying to keep her. She wanted to do these shows, but
Yes.
trying to keep all that going. The dad was obviously and mum was in a state. So where do you blame it? You go back and blame it on the poppy grower in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It
It's a
was
long
just
list. Yeah.
all, yeah, it's an all-round tragedy. But what a shame because she really was the real deal in a
She
way
was.
that only comes about once in many decades, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah. Now, I'd love to chat about your work with Ian Grant, where he's released this
Yeah.
incredible album. Ian, you met many years ago with the Stranglers,
Yeah.
was that right?
No, I met Ian
Before
before
that,
that.
long time before.
I met Ian when I was at school.
Oh,
And
really?
Ian
Right.
Yeah. Ian used to organise something called MEEPs, MEEPS. And what they were gatherings. They were a bit like early sort of acid house things, and they were gatherings in the countryside. And there was a place called Sisbury Ring in Sussex where he used to organise his events. And you'd sometimes have bands coming down from London, like Hawkwind, the Pink Fairies, would
Yeah.
rock up with a generator in the middle of the night. These things would begin at midnight and run to the dawn the next day, just
Wow.
playing loud music. Obviously, people tripping and,
Yes.
pretty wild, but they were like raves. In fact,
Yes.
they were raves. It's exactly what they were. And every now and again, the police would come in and with truncheons and bust them up. And, so Ian was a local in Sussex, where I went to school for a while. He was like a local, he was a big character,
Yeah.
I mean, he was the Mr. Bad guy, and he was always in the local press and, he was the Mr. Underground. So I knew Ian then. And then he moved to London. We both moved to London. And Ian joined up an agency called Albion.
Right.
With Derek Savage and Di Davis, and Albion controlled all the pubs in London. Um, I don't mean that to sound heavy. I mean, they
Yes.
controlled the music in
Yes.
a lot of the pubs. So it was the Nashville, the Red Cow, the Hope and Anchor. And of course, they just had pub bands who I loved and knew: Brinsley Schwartz, Ducks Deluxe, Kilburn and the High Road, Dr. Feelgood. But of course, that morphs into punk really along
Yes.
the way. Somehow these bands become the Guildford Stranglers, become the Stranglers, and the 101ers become the Clash. Anyway, and suddenly this agency are in the most unbelievable, pivotal sort of spot in the scene. Ian and I had always we remained friends, and I was going down to particularly the Nashville, seemingly every night of the week.
Yeah.
So I hadn't got anything else to do, and I'd go and see a new band every night. It was
Yes.
pretty happy days. A lot of Australians there, by the way, because it was in Earl's Court.
ACDC would
Yeah,
play
I mean,
down there. Yeah.
yeah, so but so a lot of heavy drinking and a lot
Yeah.
of great rock and roll. And then Ian said one day we got this band, the Guildford Stranglers. Do you want to come and meet Derek and Di? Because we would like to have a publicity agent. By then I'd been trained up by Keith Alton. I was working with the Who,
Yes.
so I kind of knew the ropes, and they hired me. I'm trying to remember what it was. I'm thinking about £350 a month, or was it
Right.
£150, whatever it was, and it's summer money. And then we started working. I started coming up with some Stranglers image ideas,
Yes.
and someone agreed that some of them should cut their hair. And then I came up with the idea of a fanzine called Strangled, and I
Right.
was really aping sniffing glue. And I remember the first edition of Strangled, I interviewed Paul Weller in it, who was in an unknown band called The Jam, who were playing a college.
Yes.
So
Wow.
I got an interview with Paul, but it was all like, why did you call the band The Jam? It wasn't very deep stuff. Anyway, this fanzine carries on for the next 20 years. So Ian and I, by then, I mean, we're pretty close anyway, and we're sort of, we've become, so we form a company. It just happens organically. Grant Edwards. Ian's really focusing on the Stranglers more. I've signed up the switchboard operator as a girl called Hazel O'Connor, who makes a film called Breaking Glass. Um, and the whole company really takes off. And then we
Right.
end up managing the Colt and Big Country, and we had a really big run.
Yes, yes. So that management, obviously, that was a bit of a lifeblood for him, and it's so sad to see how he's progressed now with
Yeah.
Parkinson's. But it's good like looking at the album that he's put together, which he's done a fantastic job of, by the way, Think Loud for
Yeah.
Parkinsons. There's a lot of that history that you've talked about in that album, and he's really drawn on the artists that he's known, and on obviously artists that you've known and worked with
Yeah.
throughout the years. It's almost like a collection of his life and
It
your
is.
life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Whether it's Hugh Cornwall and JJ, we spent so much of our time with them, members of Big Country, Leo Sayer, of course, who's an
Yes.
integral part of this. Leo grew up, I think Leo grew up in Shoreham in Sussex, but Ian and Leo knew each other back then. I reviewed Leo as a journalist
Yes.
for Record Mirror in about 1865 or something. So um, it was a small world then, and there wasn't layers and layers of sort of agents and managers and lawyers, and we dealt with the artists direct all the time, really. So the relationships are very personal. So I think everybody wants to help Ian.
Is there going to end up being a cure? Is it something that is a real something we've got to learn to live with?
Oh, I think great strides are being made on
Yeah.
in terms of the medicine, and no, I think there will be some sort of a cure.
Yeah.
How quickly it comes, I don't know. I mean, look, I think about it a lot. Not only has Ian got it, sadly, a lot of people have got it. The
Yeah.
statistics are startling, but also my old boss and mentor, Keith Altham, who we talk about, has also got
Yeah.
Parkinson's.
Right.
So this is a subject that is comes up a lot, and nobody really knows why it afflicts certain people.
Mm.
And is it DNA or is it diet? Nobody knows. Stress. There's all kinds of different theories. I mean, I went down to see Ian and his wife Debbie at Christmas, and James and Kirsty, and
Yeah.
I went over with my partner Chandra, and Ian was pretty lucid. We had a
Yeah.
really good day and talking about old things and playing tracks and
Yeah.
all the rest of it. I think, what anyone with Parkinson's says is they have good days and bad days.
Yeah.
And some days it's a struggle, other days things are pretty much normal. So it's it's what a thing to go through. I mean,
What a
all we
thing.
can do is, I mean, we've obviously helped a bit with the charity. One thing that I was very proud of that came about actually through this was we Ian wanted me to get Ozzy Osbourne involved, because I think
Yes.
Ozzy may have also, had some problem with this. So I called Sharon, who I knew, and it was a struggle. And I got hold of, funny enough, I couldn't get hold of Sharon, but I got hold of Phil Alexander, who's the sort of across Mojo and all of
Yeah.
those titles. And he happened to be with Sharon that day when I called. He asked Sharon, Sharon spoke to Ozzy, and then the long and short of it is that the Cure Parkinson's became one of the sponsors of the big show at Villa
At
Park
Birmingham.
with
Yeah.
Sabbath and everybody on it, and some of the proceeds go to the charity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the sort of thing we can do. Just, it's raising
Yeah.
funds for research,
And,
basically.
and he's an incredible guy in himself. He's still going to be performing, even though he's performing, from his wheelchair, from his seat. He's like, well,
Incredible.
I've got this. I'm dealing with it.
Yeah,
I'm still going to perform. You know,
incredible. And what a lineup, and
what
everybody
a
wanting
lineup.
to support him. And
Yeah,
that will be one of the great moments in rock, actually. But
it will.
yeah, I mean, I did act for Ozzy for a little while, and I found him a very nice man, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Great raconteur. And he's not the scary character you might
No,
imagine, eating birds' heads and stuff
no.
like
You can
that.
see
Not
all that's an act. You can see that.
showbiz.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think just in closing, a couple of questions. If someone's starting out in PR, obviously things are a little different these days. Is
Yeah.
it is it as different or as difficult now as what it was back then, or is it a lot easier?
Oh, it's not easier. It's a lot faster
Mm,
and it's a lot bigger. So obviously I can, in the way we're talking now, but I mean, if I issue a story and say the Who are doing some shows or something like that,
Yeah.
I'll be getting calls from all around the world within seconds, literally. So it's
Yeah.
instantaneously you're communicating with the globe. And I was telling someone asked me what was it like promoting Who Are You, which I promoted
Yes.
for the Who. And I said, well, I used to have to go around the music papers and play it to people on their record player and have a can of beer and then go to the next music paper. And then papers out of London, like the Glasgow Daily Record, I'd have to put it in an envelope with a stamp on and post it to them.
Yeah.
I mean, it would take weeks and weeks. Now, so you're distributing not only the music, but the story almost instantaneously. And
Yeah.
you see it in politics, you see it in what's happening in the world at the moment.
Yes.
Decisions are being made on the hoof and changing all our lives.
Yes.
It's so the power of it is incredible, but the pressure is incredible because it's a 24-hour beast now. If a story
Yeah.
comes out that's incorrect, which happens, mistakes get made, and you're trying to correct it, which is often the situation the PR finds yourself in.
Mm.
It's like whack-a-mole. You're trying to stop. It could come out in 20 or 30 outlets within an hour.
Yeah.
So you're calling them all up or emailing them saying, look, I know you got this story, but actually they weren't in the country and that didn't happen. It was an erroneous sort of
Yes.
report or whatever. And then you dampen the thing down. So technically, and then of course you've got massive, entourages and people involved
Yes.
and layers of, so if you could be on a conference call or rather more likely an email trail with 40 or 50 people. So there's a
Yeah.
tendency for everything to be risk averse and not be, the maverick way that I grew up doing it can be harder.
Yeah.
But having said all of that, it's still about the art of storytelling.
Yes.
Um, and it's still about knowing people and talking to people. So in some ways, I find that the job hasn't changed that much. I mean, I persuaded Usher to do an interview with the Evening Standard last week, and
Mm.
Dylan Jones did it, and it turned out to be the most fantastic piece. They put it on the front cover. It was everywhere in London, and Usher talked about his love of Sinatra and his friendship with Ed Sheeran and a lot of stuff that
Yeah.
you wouldn't have expected, and it just worked out great. But that was very old fashioned, really. It was me
Yeah.
calling Dylan and, me having a drink with the editor and me talking to the artist. And we sat down in a room and had a conversation. So I still find that old school storytelling is at the root of good PR,
Yeah.
always.
Yeah. Yeah. Storytelling, relationship building, and yeah, I love it. Final thing, what are you listening to? I love asking this question. What are you listening to on your turntable right now?
Turntable right now. What did I? Well, yesterday was an eco day for some reason, so I must have been in some kind of a mood. Um, Day before was Handel, which I really enjoy. And then someone just sent me a book on Miles Davis, so I guess that could be on
I love it.
that could be happening today.
Yeah.
So, but I've got what I call the greatest playlist ever or something that I've comprised, and it's got well over 1,000 songs. So a lot of the time I lucky dip into it. So
Yeah.
I could end up on Aerosmith, or I could end up on, Fairport Convention.
I love it.
It's unpredictable, or
Yeah.
Crowded House, or In Excess, or who knows what.
Who know? Love the Aussie bands. That's good. That's good.
Yeah,
Look,
I did PR for a little known fact, and I can't remember much about it, but I did do the PR for Men at Work, Land Down Under.
did you really?
And
That
I
would have been
met
a
the
hard
band. They
song to
came,
to promote.
well, it was a different world. I must have brought everybody, I tried to get every Australian who was in London to come,
Yes.
and they did a show in Victoria. And I went to the show, and the band were very nice, but it was like one of those enormous hits.
Yes.
And then I never saw the group again. But you never, the song lives forever, doesn't it? It's
It
sort of,
does. It
it's
does.
there. So I played my little part in that somewhere. I just can't remember what I did, but I was in the mix.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Look, Alan, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and really appreciate it. Appreciate all the work that you have done on this, working with Ian as well, and this
Of
album
course.
that's been created. And go out and buy the album. Think Loud for Parkinsons. It's for an absolute worthy cause. So
A
Yeah.
brilliant cause. I can testify to that.
Yeah.
So,
Alan, absolute pleasure. Thanks for
Jane,
joining me on
good
the show.
talking. Have a good evening, and
You too.
hopefully we'll catch up again one day. I'm hoping. I have been there before, of course. I'm hoping to come back down. So fingers crossed.
Do it. Absolutely. We'll have a beer. Sounds good.
It'll be a pleasure.
Thanks, Alan. Cheers.
Cheers, Shane.